of the Center for Latin American Studies. Let me first thank the co-sponsors of our annual conference, the Georges Mothers Library, the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere, the Center for Gender, Sexuality, and Women Studies Research, the Center for African Studies, the Center for European Studies, the Department of Political Science, the Sweetwater Branch Inc., the Bacardi Family Foundation, and the Department of Education Title VI Fellowship. My deep gratitude to the center's staff that makes this possible, in particular to Kim Hodges, Jessica Mrosinski-Baker, and Krista Markley. So please, let's give them a. We are so fortunate at the center to have such a dedicated and wonderful and professional staff. This year, we're fortunate and honored to have with us Dr. Flavia Biroli. She's an expert on feminism, democratization, and the attacks on gender and sexuality rights. Later on, Juliana Restrepo Sanin will introduce her properly, but thank you, Flavia, for being here. The topic of our annual conference this year are the authoritarian challenges to democracy in the Americas and worldwide. Currently, in the name of countering gender ideology and defending the family, right-wing and self-described left-wing politicians are attacking the incomplete but important rights that women and LGBTQ plus communities had struggled for over several decades. Using tropes of law and order, they are also restricting citizen rights. We will have a few papers on the left in Mexico, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, but most of the discussion will center on what we might call a radical right populist wave. Jair Bolsonaro and Javier Milei were elected in the largest nations in South America. When Bolsonaro lost an election, he cried fraud and organized a failed military coup, following the example of his idol that currently resides in Mar-a-Lago. How can we name these politicians and their policies? Are they radical right-wing populists? Are they post-fascist? Or are they what historian Federico Finkelstein calls wannabe fascists that do not have the will or are unable to create fascist regimes? What is new about the current crisis of democracy compared to previous periods of democratic decay when the right and the left advocated for dictatorship to replace parliamentarism in the 1920s and 30s? What are the new discourses and policies on gender and sexuality, and why there is a backlash against these rights? How are citizens and social movements resistant? The different panels of the conference will give us academic and scholarly input to learn more about our current times in Latin America and beyond. We have gathered an interdisciplinary group of political scientists, sociologists, communication studies people, historians, and political theorists. We will close the conference with comparative papers with other world regions to take advantage that the new directors of African and European studies do also work on populism, democratization, and authoritarianism. Please enjoy and participate in these debates. Thanks for coming today, and I hope I will see you tomorrow. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks to our speakers for agreeing to come from many parts of the United States and Latin America. So, Juliana Restrepo Sanin, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Juliana Restrepo Sanin, and I'm in the Department of Political Science. I'm moderating the first panel on gender and LGBTQ rights. And our first panelist is Dr. Elizabeth Corredor. She is a visiting professor. She's a visiting assistant professor at Bryn Mawr College, and her research interests include gender and LGBTQ plus rights, peace negotiations and agreements, populism, and religious political movements, among others. So I welcome Elizabeth. Each of our panelists will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we will go to Q&A.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much to Carlos, to Juliana, and to everyone for putting this together. This is fantastic. I'm honored to be here. Today, I'm going to talk about some research that I've been percolating on, haven't had a ton of time to get to, but have think that I might be onto something. So this is sort of this little bit of exploratory, throwing some ideas out there. But I'm really interested in this intersection of civil society, gender and religion and democratic backsliding, and in thinking in terms about how gender equality, religious freedom, and civil society are key components of democracy, and how what we're actually seeing is that these components themselves being used for illiberal agendas. And so I think I'm just going to sort of get started, but what I would like to do is show how gender and anti-genderism more specifically can actually tell us a lot about populism, and sort of maybe reversing the conversation from what we learn about anti-genderism through populism, but rather the other way around. So how does do I use this? There, okay. You can use it. Okay, great. Okay, so my interest in this topic emerged from my book project, which examines the gender and LGBTQ inclusions in the 2010 to 2016 Colombian peace process. And for those of you who are familiar or know that in 2016, when the agreement was finalized, it went out to the public for a vote for a national referendum to vote yes or no for it. And surprisingly, what happened was there was a significant backlash, a significant mobilization against the inclusions of gender and LGBTQ language in the peace agreement. And this was the first time, this was 2016, it was the first time I had heard this term, ideología de género. And the more I looked into it, what I saw and found was that this was actually a trope that was being used all around the globe, mostly at the time in Europe and starting to move into Latin America, against gender and LGBTQ equality. And you know, further looking into it, there seemed to be a lot of relationship between the rise of populism and democratic backsliding, in seeing that we see in 2016 to 2019 a significant dip in support for democracy in Latin America, which also coincides when these movements sort of rose up in the region. And so this is really what prompted my interest in taking a look at this phenomenon further. So what I think I'm going to do today is I just want to talk specifically about what I mean by anti-genderism, because it is sort of a specific phenomenon that is not just anti-feminism or anti-LGBTQ rights. And then I want to talk about the discussion that's happened so far around this idea of opportunistic synergy between anti-genderism and populism, and why they seem to go so well together. But then I want to sort of push back on some of the existing literature that's out there, and talk about how ontological insecurity might help us understand how populism is to frame the conversation around populism as a mechanism of patriarchy versus the other way around. So just very quickly, when we talk about anti-genderism, talking about an epistemological response or resistance to emancipatory claims about sex, gender, and sexuality. It really comes down to this debate of what do we mean by gender? Is it something that is biologically determined? Does it solely rest in biological sex? Or is it something that is socially constructed, that's something that is inherently relational, and something that is infused with power? And these are theories that emerged in the 1990s and in academia among feminist and queer scholars, but it also coincided with massive transnational feminism that was happening at the UN in the 1990s. These mobilizations were happening from the 70s on, but it was in the 1990s that feminist and lesbian women were entering these spaces at the UN, claiming that these policies are not gender neutral, and we need to ensure that we are thinking about gendered, not just in terms of men and women and rights, but thinking about gender as a source of power in policy, which led to this concept of gender mainstreaming, which is the process of assessing the gendered implications in legislation, in institutional design, and in policy in the name of gender equality. And while gender mainstreaming is a very democratic practice, right? It speaks to democracy. It's about elevating gender equality. And normatively, it's hard to contest. People don't push back necessarily on the concept of gender equality, but operationalizing it is incredibly fraught. And this is really where we start to see a lot of resistance and pushback that comes back in all sorts of different levels. Sometimes it is very overt and massive and takes the form of street protests. Other times it is much more subtle, and we must peel back the layers of our institutions to find it. But the reason it is so fraught is because it's seeking to permeate all aspects of public life and really undo existing ways of being, and it's asking to a new way of doing politics. And so in the process of gender mainstreaming, we must define what the word gender means. And this is what can get very, very, very complicated, as we've seen with the Istanbul Convention in Europe, and this is in the Colombian peace process. It came down to what did they mean by gender? How are they defining it? How are they defining it as gender? Was it related only to biological sex, or was it about a greater power system? And a key, the Vatican has been very, and was during this time in the 1990s when this was all happening, was a key player in pushing back against this. And they were quite successful. They had a lot of success at the UN in keeping the definition of genders to be just around biological sex. And they, took this term gender ideology and actually codified it. They defined it, they published it, calling it a work of science fiction by radical feminists, that it erases the complementary differences between men and women, that it promotes homosexuality and incites gender confusion among children. And this trope, gender ideology or ideología de género, was very powerful. In the late 2000s, throughout Europe, politicians, along with the Catholic Church and civil society organizations, were mobilizing against LGBTQ rights and women's reproductive rights and a whole host of different policy in the name of gender ideology. But we saw it also come into Latin America. And it's interesting because here we start to see it changes a bit, because we have the entrance of now Protestant evangelicals and conservatives operating. It no longer becomes just a Catholic endeavor. And we see sort of the new religious formations happening. Latin America also offers a very different context than Europe in terms of populism, because as we know, populism in Latin America has a much longer and richer history than what we are seeing happening right now in Europe. And so these anti-gender campaigns were taking on sort of their own character and their own ways of being. Nonetheless, as Carlos mentioned, a lot of the focus ends up being on right-wing populism, and where we see this intersection of these anti-gender campaigns tends to be primarily in right-wing groups. And so the question is, why is that, right? And so there's this concept of sort of opportunistic synergy that work, because both this concept of anti-genderism and ideología de género is inherently illiberal and exclusionary. It thrives in weakened democratic conditions. It exploits democracy in the name of democracy, but for undemocratic goals. And it's dependent upon deep polarization in civil society, right? It depends, both populism and anti-genderism depends on this wide dissatisfaction among people and the lack of trust that happen. And so nonetheless, there's studies around gender in populism have still been quite marginalized. I think there's still been an effort to try to center it more and kind of get more recognition of it. But nonetheless, as Dietz claims, the populist obsession with gender and sexuality is hard to overlook. And the literature currently looks, in thinking about this relationship, has looked mostly at voting behavior. Why do women, or who votes for these populist leaders who espouse anti-gender rhetoric, women populist leaders, But mostly a lot of it looks at a strategy for candidates that populist groups are using anti-gender and capitalizing on anti-LGBTQ and anti-feminist sentiments to further their campaign. And so the relationship tends to sort of be centering populism and liberalism, and that gender and anti-gender are a byproduct of this. And we see this even in the language on gender and democracy and gender and populism, where here Graf and Corredor say that gender is part of a broader context where what is truly at stake is the future of democracy. Sort of prioritizing democracy in what's happening here. And say that anti-gender campaigns are part of a broader resurgence of right-wing extremism and religious fundamentalism. In other words, gender seems to be a mechanism for populism. Kovacs has said that anti-genderism is a symbol of larger systemic crisis of a liberalism, and that these movements are not necessarily anti-feminist or homophobic per se, but that gender provides this theater for the struggle of a liberalism. And I think what Kovacs is trying to say is that this is a strategy, even if there isn't a deep ideological commitment to anti-genderism, they'll still use it to promote their efforts. But I want to push back a bit on this and about this idea of starting with populism and liberalism and thinking of gender and anti-genderism as a mechanism. Because full stop, anti-genderism is always homophobic. It is always anti-feminist, even if it is not the primary driver, but the action and the language and the goals in which it serves certainly are. And gender equality, regardless of what system it is in, is a fundamental value of its own right. And gender equality and inequality is a struggle regardless of whether it's regardless of the political system. It is still extremely fraught in democracy, and democracy still has yet to fully understand gender equality. And so it doesn't need to be tied to democracy to be fundamental. And so if we sort of were to think about gender hierarchies inform populism and liberalism, we might get sort of some new answers or some new understandings. And so I'm trying to show that anti-genderism and gender equality and inequality are fundamental phenomenons in their own right, and that these patriarchal and heteronormative norms operate above, within, and around democracy. So if we flipped the script on this, what if we looked at populism as the theater for gender and sexuality? What if we looked at populism as the mechanism for maintaining gender and sexual inequality and these gendered hierarchies? And so my argument, and what I'm sort of trying to work toward and very early in the stages and thinking through, is that anti-genderism is not a side effect, an upshot, or a product of populism. It is something that existed before populism. It moves through populism, and it will exist after. So in other words, populism is if we think about populism as the mechanism, I think we might start to understand a little bit more about this relationship. So why is this important? Again, anti-genderism is it's a deeply entrenched societal phenomenon. It emerged in the 1990s when we started really struggling with these concepts of what gender is. Those struggles are not going away, even if populism sort of shifts and manifests and change. They're going to continue to be with us. They're going to manifest themselves differently. So it can and should be looked at something that operates independently of, and at times comes into contact with populism, any liberalism. And it will manifest. So even if populism collapses, fails, changes, dissipates, anti-genderism will remain, and it will manifest in new ways. It will take on new forms, because that's how these power hierarchies, whether we're talking about race, sexuality, gender, how they operate. They don't sort of go away. They find new ways to connect within their context, because they are embedded in all of our political systems. So I'm thinking, and I don't have, I won't talk too much about this, but I think that this idea of an ontological security framework can help us understand why anti-genderism is not populist per se, but also show how populism serves as a mechanism for maintaining patriarchy and maintaining gender and sexual inequality. Ontological security is comes from psychology. It refers to the stability of one's sense of self in the world. It is about one's place and role and having sort of a predictable place and sense of themselves. It's about routine, familiarity, consistency, predictability. And if we think about this, religion provides a lot of this for folks. The state is also, in theory, supposed to also be providing this. But it's a basic human need that is rooted in stability and predictability. We as human beings need that. And when that gets disrupted, there's a lot of anxiety that comes around it. And what's interesting is that both gender norms and democracy are inherently unstable and lack predictability. They are processes that are always in flux and always in motion. So they're always going to be challenging ontological security, whether it is of the person or of the state or of the system. And I think that this can help explain this opportunistic synergy between the two. Because gender hierarchies are deeply embedded in every part of public and private life, when we disrupt them, gender equality inevitably disrupts them. It doesn't matter what the political system is. It doesn't matter if it's a democracy or illiberal democracy, whether it's an authoritarian regime, whatnot. Gender equality is always going to sort of bring that about. And the claim, right, and populists, one of the things that they do so well is claim to be the providers of ontological security. They're giving you the answers. They are giving you a definite. They're explaining the world to you, and they are going to solve this problem for you. And I think that this might help explain why gender inequality and anti-genderism appears to be more visible in the context of populism, but not necessarily is. It becomes more visible because they're using it. And so this is how I'm thinking that populism is a mechanism for it, right? It brings visibility to something that is already there, that's already in existence. And so we think about this as, or I've sort of been thinking about this, that if we think about populism as a mechanism for patriarchy, because populism weaponizes the gender dimensions of ontological security. Not only to garner support, it certainly does do it to garner support, to mobilize the masses and whatnot, but it's also serving to remind women and LGBTQ people when a do not cross line has been breached and when our civic membership is always potentially revocable. Just coming from Townsend Bell and Murab from a fantastic special issue on backlash and signs. And so I think that this is, something we need to always keep in mind, that this is where we are at the core of anti-genderism is this. And so again, I'm thinking about anti-genderism as perpetuating through politics. And I think where I want to leave this now is, and where my research is going, is thinking that this should be our starting place for unpacking the relationship between gender and illiberalism. Sort of flipping that script a little bit. So thank you. And I look forward to hearing the next speakers. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Our next panelist is Dr. Luz del Alba Acevedo. She's a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras. Her research interests include women and gender studies development, comparative public policy in Latin America, among other topics. And her presentation is called The New Right Threat to Colonial Democracy, Proyecto, Dignidad, and Women's Political Rights in Puerto Rico.
First of all, I would like to thank the University of Florida and especially Carlos for giving me this opportunity to address to you my recent research on the issue of the new right in Puerto Rico and how it has been a threat to colonial democracy. The majority of the Puerto Ricans were surprised in 2020 that a new party emerged as an electoral force that really gained some support among the people. 2 women legislators were elected, and 1 municipal legislature. This party was founded in 2019, is characterized by its fundamentalist, religious, social, and economic values. It differentiates itself from the other traditional parties because this new party moves away from the status question of the island. The political parties in Puerto Rico, they are defined according to their position to the US, annexionismo, Estado librismo, or independence. This is not the case of Partido Dignidad. Partido Dignidad centers on the sanctity of life, family, and childhood, and distancing itself from those traditional venues. The PD, it has defined a new brand of Puerto Rican political conservatism guided by libertarian values about the individual and the family and free enterprise. Its public policy focuses on proposing bills that seeks to restrict, eliminate, or ban reproductive rights and sexuality of women and other sexual minorities. The notion of a new right in Puerto Rico and Latin America, I think, transcends the neoliberal project of fiscal adjustment policies, economic liberalization, and reduction of state intervention in the economy and society. Their agenda and discourse go beyond market fundamentalism and laissez-faire. It brings the process of what I call culturalization of politics, where the division and political support for the parties are forged and shaped by traditional social and religious values and the ideology of female domesticity regarding family and sexuality. The emergence of this new political force has brought on an assault to the colonial democracy and a political attack on feminism and the rights of Puerto Rican women and sexual minority. The legislative agenda of the PD reduces and reproduces aspects of the cultural counter-feminism in the United States. But how this comes about, what I call the eruption of the new right in Puerto Rico's electoral politics? Well, it comes since the 1970s. There are 3 religious forces that in the 20th century, 21st century, comes and merge together. What I call the Catugumberos. Probably you don't know what the Catugumberos are, but these people are, it is a Christian who feel that they themselves are excluded from the church. And they usually met in remote places for doing the religious evangelical cults. And they are something similar to what the Americans call the Jesus freak. Okay. The second one is the pro-life Catholics and evangelicals that are anti-abortions. And this is the issue that they come together. The third one is the neo-Pentecostal and that preaches and follow el evangelio del progreso, ¿verdad? The prosperity gospel. Since 1970s, these groups have been coming together. They have organized, coming together to protest against the issues of abortion, sexuality, and the rights of the LGBT community. But what are the factors that led to this phenomenon to emerge, to erupt in the political scene? Well, let me see if I can, okay. There are economic factors, there are political factors, there are social factors. Among the economic factors, first of all, is the corruption, okay, and the collapse of the governance model in Puerto Rico. Also, as a second one, is the breakdown of the clientelistic relationship between PNP is the annexionist party that has governed a lot during the last 20 years. And this administration, the PNP administration of government, they have always got relation with the neo-Pentecostal organization since 1992. And this broke down. Why? Well, the rupture came because the government was distributing contraception among public students, adoption, and they also adopted the same-sex marriage as determined by the U.S. Supreme Court, and most recently, over the creation in 2017, from part of the government, the executive part, la Oficina de Asuntos para la Comunidad LGBTQ. Okay, this was it. The rupture was immediately. Secondly, third, there's an important thing is the realignment of in the economic factors, the failure of economic and infrastructure recovery after Huracán María and the earthquake in Puerto Rico in the 2020. This recovery has not been get through. The other ones, the political factors, aside from the corruption and the collapse of the government of Puerto Rico, it is the realignment of the political forces that are extremely important. In this realignment, it has emerged a new political party. New political parties have been emerging since 2012, but in 2016, there was an important thing that is many people started to become independent candidates, which was absolutely new for Puerto Rico. The most important person was Alexandra Lugaro, which is a young woman that proclaimed to be atheist, having a child without through artificial insemination, supporting independence and values, and having used marijuana. That was her card of presentation. For the first time, and she managed to get 11% of the votes. In 2020, Alexandra Lugaro comes all over again, but in this case with a new party, Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana, which is a center-left party. And in this time, in the 2020, she really makes a good strike. But the problem was that all the eyes of the Puerto Rican people and all the analysts were looking at Alexandra Lugaro and el Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana. And what happens? The PD comes behind, and they were the one who were elected. That's interesting. What are the other social factors that contributes to these? Well, absolutely, the massive migration to the United States of Puerto Ricans, especially the impressive migration after Huracán María, because it really distorted the family, it destroyed families, it distorted communities, and this was an important factor, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic that was not well led from a political point of view. Surprisingly, as I said, the PD received only 7% of the votes, but they were able to get 2 of these women into the legislative scene. The electoral performance was surprised even for these 4 people. They were surprised themselves because they are advenedizos, newcomers to the political scenario. They were not politicians, they were not associated with government administration, but they really made a good presence in here. As you can see in the picture that you're seeing, this PD party is led by white heterosexual men and other 3 women. And it's very interesting. These are 2 white women, 1 black woman or trigueño or mulatto, whatever you want to see here, okay? And it shows that this is an interesting composition, okay? That it could be said that this is the picture of the right Puerto Rican inclusiveness. There was also generational diversity because the blonde woman that you see there, she is a media, absolutely controls the social media's environment. And she presents herself as the two generations, the older woman and herself. One of the questions that I have during the course of my research is the PD a populist party? What is the political ideology of this party? Well, obviously, the slogans that they use, nuestro proyecto es Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico puede, el cambio es posible, dignidad para todo, dignity for everyone. It's definitely populist slogans that appeals to the fiber of the cultural nationalism and Christianity of the Puerto Rican people. The PD discourses establish a polar dichotomy between the dignified people, us, and the corrupt political elite, represented by the ruling parties of the PNP, Anexionistas, and the PPD, Estado-Libristas. The PD leadership criticizes establishment that works for a few and does not serve the people who need redemption through a project whose centrality is the people of Puerto Rico. This new polarization brings a shift in the axis that dominates the country's political discussion. It is no longer the traditional partisan discussion of the status formulas that I mentioned before, but about the moral imperative to address issues of corruption, to establish good governance, and redeem society from the liberal secularism of the parties that alternate power under the protection of American civil laws. Hence, the thematic core of the political prioritization of the new right is corruption, family, marriage, children, education, abortion, and gender identity. The new populist discourse aims at interpolate emotions and cultural nationalist feelings, not independence, not in favor of independence, but to unify the people, the ordinary person in the street, tired of the same thing. Although the PD leadership is not charismatic, the populist dimension of the PD can be identified in its anti-establishment Christian rhetoric and its attraction to the dissolution and the disaffected religious sectors of the Puerto Rican annexionist right. What are the social and economic fundamentalism? And I'm going to go fast in here. As you can observe in my slides, there are social policies centered on gender, education, abortion, and all of these things that the political link between this social conservatism based on religious principles and neoliberal free market policies provide the tool for the governmental re-engineering proposed by the PD. It is a marriage between religious fundamentalism and the market fundamentalism. The economic policies, on the other hand, strengthening the communities, elimination of taxes, reduction of government, etc. These economic policies of the PD are based on neoliberal principles that proposes a very complex marriage between religious and market fundamentalism that are aimed at the regulation of society that will result of the erosion of social economic rights acquired by individuals. This is the social policies are used to regulate society, but the economic policies proposed are geared to deregulate the market. Where these ideas come from? Where these ideas come from? Well, I have been able to trace the link of the right wing, this new right wing, with think tanks between Puerto Rico and Latin America. The ideas of social and other countries of Latin America. The ideas of social and economic fundamentalism described in the previous slide provide the core knowledge based upon which the PD's consecutive legislative agenda and conservative agenda anchors political projects for government reengineering and the reconfiguration of social priorities. The public debate around the social and economic fundamentalism of the PD is ignited a battle of ideas and positions presented as scientific truths, but whose purpose is to strengthen the moral authority of the new populist right in the field of politics and culture. This war of position, in a paradoxical term of Antonio Gramsci's concept, penetrates the daily socio-political life of individuals. It is, so to speak, a battle for cultural hegemony. In this cultural battle, the PD has established connections with think tanks or centros de pensamiento in Latin America that provide the ideological and the rhetorical support, as well as political advice and public policy formulation. These think tanks constitute, and you can see in the slide, el Instituto, the Institute of Economic Liberty, ILE, el Instituto de Libre Economía, recently created in Puerto Rico, the Foundation for Progress, based in Chile, and the Liberty Foundation, based in Argentina. These organizations are sources of ideas and data and facts. These facts tend to come from data produced by neoliberal think tanks, such as the Adam Smith Institute, or by the organizations themselves. Axel Kaiser from Chile, Agustín Laje from Argentina are the recurrent Latin American political ideologues, connecting the right-wing new views with the development of the PD's political project. It's worth noting that a leadership that predominantly favors statehood annexionismo with the United States, such as the PD, will seek ideological guidance from Latin American countries. This may explain, I think, this is to be researched, it be explained by the racist and xenophobic ideologies pervasive in the US and European ultra-right think tanks. But let me go rapidly over the attacks on women. Women attacks come in two bases. First, the PD legislature have opposed the real important legislation affecting women's rights. Among them is the declaration of a state of emergency to stop the growing violence against women in Puerto Rico. The number of feminicides have been growing in a large scale. The implementation of a gender perspective in the curriculum in the public school. We have been talking about that since 2012 election, and it has never been put forward because it always has been banned by some kind of thing. But the important in here was that these two legislatures, they banned these using strategies. They used the judicial courts strategy. They presented a lawsuit against the executive, the government, saying that executive cannot make decisions on this. It is the legislature who has to do this. So there was a lawsuit against that. And the other thing is they really coerce the people, the other legislators, because the governor wants a secretary of education, and a secretary of education has to be approved by the Senate. So what they managed was to water down this curriculum, and the gender perspective curriculum of the public schools in Puerto Rico became known as el currículo de equidad y respeto para el ser humano. Okay, rapidly. Among the other things that they did, they opposed the bill to restrict the rights of women and the LGBT community, abortion, the rights of the newborn. They banned the adoption of children by the people of the same sex, banned participation of transsexuals in sport. They revert inclusive bathrooms. They have banned the use of public institutions for trans to make their entertainment, their shows, like the Coca-Cola Music Hall is funded by the government. They cannot use those kinds of facilities. None of these bills have been yet approved. However, 2024 elections are coming, and they have already put so many people behind the PD that we know that this is going to be a problem. The most important problem is abortion, because abortion in Puerto Rico is, okay, it was allowed because of two judicial pillars. One is that the colony, the US extended to the colony the Roe versus Wade legislation. The second was that in the 1980s, the Puerto Rican Supreme Court, in a special case, they accepted that abortion was okay. It is a right for women because they were able to make a statute that enshrined that right in the Constitution of Puerto Rico. However, the US reverted Roe versus Wade. So one of the most important pillars is gone, and now they have another chance as to come up with these kind of things. This is my conclusion. Women's bodies are under siege. And what I think is that they have introduced so many bills that ban and restrict that this is what I think is happening. At the center of the public debate on the attack on women and sexual minority rights is the controversy over meaning, gender ideology versus gender perspective. In the PD discourse, the category gender is interpreted as synonymous with sexual identity, which in turn is understood as an ideology of activist groups that attack the freedom of belief, philosophies of life, and religion of all citizens, particularly Christians. That's what they believe. Such interpretation denies, I think, the methodological power of the category of gender, because it denies the importance of recognizing, of explaining gender differences, gender inequalities, explaining the discrimination based on sex and gender as well, and to explain the structural conditions against the injustice, structural conditions against women. The battle over the meaning of the gender perspective launched by the new right has important consequences for women's organizing, feminist mobilization, and party politics for the 2024 election. The aim of the PD is to mainstream religious values and libertarian principles into public policies while derailing the gender perspective from the political agenda. The constant attack on women's rights and in this 4-year period, only 4 years period, turn women's bodies into the terrain of cultural and political battle, where the country's social and economic policies are negotiated. These represent a political counterattack on Puerto Rican feminism and its political struggles, and a backsliding of a colonial democracy that is already weak. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Dr. María Inclán. She is professor of political science at the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas, CIDE, in Mexico. Her research interests include indigenous and urban protest movements, cycles of protest, and their relationship with democratic transitions. Her talk is on feminism and democratic resilience in Mexico.
Thank you very much. And again, I want to thank Carlos for inviting me to take part in this conference and to talk about feminism or women's rights movements in Mexico as a democratic resilience force in the country. I have to make a disclaimer. I'm not an expert on feminism, and so I'm just venturing into this field. And when Carlos invited me to come, it coincided with my sabbatical leave at the Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales at the National Autonomous University in Mexico, where my sister is at. And I was asked to write about feminism and democratic resilience. And so it coincided, and it worked pretty well. And I had the chance to work with my sister again. This is the second time that we do it. It was the first paper, and then the battles between co-authors when it's your sibling can escalate to a different level. So that's why it took us many years to write together again. Anyway, so we conceive the feminism as this democratic resilience force in Mexico for several reasons, and there are three reasons that we will try to expose in this essay. And should I use, yeah. And we see the current feminist movement as like the third relay of social movements that have been underlying democratizing efforts in the country. And so the first, we think that it was the movement that emerged after the Zapatista uprising that not only helped indirectly helped to make the country an electoral democracy and have an electoral authority that takes care of elections and for them to be there more competitive, but also push forward the inclusion of minority rights in the constitution of the country, and that was achieved in 2003. Then in the 2000s, when crime violence was increasing, the movement against violence and crime has been pushing for measures to increase safety and the rule of law, and we have yet to witness the materialization of those reforms. And nowadays, we think that women's rights movement should be the resilient force behind the defense of democracy in the country. And even though we see that women's groups and feminist groups have been achieving successes, and I will present some of those, they have not presented themselves as this democratizing force or as a group that defends democracy. And we would like to argue that they should do so publicly, not only through the different actions that they have achieved. So we see that feminists nothing of what I'm saying today is new or something that you don't know, but apparently is necessary to be said again, especially in the country and especially when we are facing an increasingly autocratic government that used to be an ally to these groups, and that these groups help to legitimize the victory of López Obrador and Morena. So feminism is a democratic resilience force because it's a social movement that fights for the majority of or half of the population, the rights of half of the population. And if we consider that in all countries it's like 51%, then we can talk about the majority. It's a social movement that it's fighting for human rights, because if we are gonna go back to that wonderful idea that women's rights are human rights, then, well, we're fighting for the rights of all. And it's a social movement, as I said, that it's fighting an increasingly autocratic government. As a movement for women's rights, the two most salient causes in the country right now are the rights to choose and the rights for a life without violence. And of course, underlying these two main causes, and we see the protest every March 8th, and in September is, thank you. There are all these other causes for labor rights, for social security, for health services, for safety and justice. But they should start framing their causes as defending the rights of women are defending the rights of all the citizenry, and not only stay the necessary fight for women's rights. As a movement for human rights, well, the rights to choose does not only apply for women and abortions, but for the rights to choose over their own bodies. And so in doing that, they are protecting already in particular the trans community, but anybody that has a say on what they want to do with their bodies. The right to a life without violence against is illustrated and defended by the victims of feminicide and the relatives of the victims of feminicides, but it should be access to justice to all murder cases. And protecting the integrity of all without discrimination of any kind. And I'm not saying that they should be washed out and forget about the causes of women, but to present the women as the defenders of these rights that are applicable to all. And again, that counts for labor equality. And so in presenting their causes as human rights, then they are universal and unalienable. And therefore you're defending the rights of everybody without discrimination. And I cannot emphasize this enough when we have another problem in the country that is the increasing impunity. So the rights of all are at stake. And the women, if they have been successful in defending their rights, then they should advertise that in doing this, they are defending the rights of all. So what happens when they are fighting an increasingly autocratic government that used to be their political ally? In coming to office, López Obrador, the first actions that he took was to dismantle the lean progress that had been made on women's rights, especially for working women and the women victims of domestic violence. And so all the shelter system that existed that was dismantled, as well as daycare services and full-time schools for working women. So they will benefit from supporting a justice reform, if they want to continue supporting the cause for a life without violence. To guarantee proper funding for justice administration is easing access to justice, all the professionalization of the justice administration personnel during the whole process, and protecting, even when including gender perspective in justice administration. By doing that, they can protect the physical and emotional integrity of victims and defendants, because we know that those in Mexico, particularly the justice system, does a very poor job in doing that. So currently, when we are seeing that Morena wants to pass reforms to dismantle the prevailing constitutional order, women could come as their groups to defend the judicial independence and democracy if they want to have women's rights protected by the justice system. So there have been some gains and some successes that these groups have achieved, and I think that they should do more of that, but as I said, advertise it not only as protecting the rights of women, but the rights of all. One is Impunidad Cero, which is an organization that facilitates and provides all the information for victims that present cases in the justice system to know about how to present a case, what are their options, how does the investigation go, and even, I mean, the number of cases that actually reach justice is very low. But even when those cases reach justice, there is a huge lack of information of what are the options for the victims. And so this organization has been easing justice information for victims. The other is Red Mujeres en Plural, which are the women in Congress. And they have passed several laws that are important. One is the Ley 3 de 3 contra la violencia, and that reached constitutional order, which is preventing anybody to run for office that has committed either a sexual crime or domestic violence, or is not providing the child support. And so by reaching, but again, they present that as the only, of course, the majority of cases come from men against women. But once you reach that achievement, it's not only going to protect women, right? It's going to protect all, and they don't advertise it as such. Why? Well, we can think about whether I see two possible causes for that. One is that they are facing this autocratic government that used to be their political ally, and so they have to be very sensitive on how they present the cause. And the other are the internal divisions, again, within the movement that we see that will occur in any social movement. Other laws that they have passed is the one against the digital violence or chemical violence, or publishing images of aggression. But again, in doing that, they have achieved this, and everybody's going to benefit from those laws. So our recommendation, or our hope more than a recommendation, is that their demands will be framed about related causes, right? To denounce all backsliding, and publicly so, to build solidarity across civil society organizations and the social movements that have emerged during this government, that apparently they have been atomized or focalized, as I said, because are movements that are demanding the violation of their rights, or the erosion of prerogative and previously acquired rights, but they have not been able to reach further solidarity. And the feminist movement overlaps all these different causes. And so it will be easy for them to support related causes that will support their own. And become this umbrella movement against the democratic erosion that we are experiencing currently in Mexico. And I believe that there will be the time that they will have to come to make this public announcement, and hopefully that won't be too late. Thank you.
Thank you. Our last paper is actually a co-author paper. The first author, I'm not sure if that's the order, but let's say that's how it was in the program, is Dr. Cecilia Menjivar. She's Professor and Dorothy L. Meyer Social Equities Chair at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her research explores how state power manifests through legal regimes, bureaucracies, and formal institutions in the microprocesses of everyday life, mainly focused on the context that mainly Central American migrants encounter mostly in the United States, as well as the judicial system failures that sustain gender-based violence in Central America. And Dr. Pamela Neumann is an assistant professor of sociology in the social science department at Texas A&M International University. Her research interests include gender, development, violence, and social movements in Latin America. And their talk is entitled The Gender Consequences of Authoritarianism in Central America. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Carlos, and thank you for inviting us to present our work and to share our work here, especially on this panel, because as you will see, everything that has been said before resonates in our work. Every point that has been made is almost like we're summarizing everything and putting it in the context of Central America. We never corresponded, we were never in touch, but you will see the incredible parallels. So I'm very, very thankful to have been placed in this amazing group of scholars thinking about these issues. So let's see. So does it go with this or this? Here? Okay. So when we think of migration from Central America, especially women's migration, we hear a lot about a crisis, especially happening at the border, and a crisis in Central America, and crisis related to migrants, related to the region, and people get seemingly seriously interested in trying to understand why this is happening. And so Vice President Harris, for instance, traveled to Central America to find out what was going on in that region, really very seriously interested in finding the root causes of migration. Why were people fleeing the region? Why are women fleeing the region for supposedly for gender-based violence reasons? And so there's a lot of rhetoric about root causes of migration from Central America, especially with relation to why women leave the region. And so we decided with Pamela to respond and to contribute to this conversation by focusing on trying to understand the conditions under which gender-based violence happens, and as a root cause of migration. But instead of focusing on individual behaviors, trying to understand why men commit crimes, why men do this, why families don't help, why the police doesn't help, we take a step back from all of that and take a decidedly structural approach to trying to understand why how conditions in that context are created that precipitate and create conditions for gender-based violence to begin with. How is that maintained? How justice systems fail to provide protection, and how justice, access to justice is also undermined. So we try to cover the whole process by taking a structural look at the issue. So today this is a larger project. This is a book project we're working on. So we're going to just give you a glimpse of how we're thinking and how we're structuring our work. So today we're going to first, I'll give you just a couple of points of what we include in this framework of structural conditions that we are trying to get at. Just a little bit about the regional context of Central America, how and where our analytical approach comes from. And then Pamela is going to present only 2 cases from the 4 cases that we're looking at. We're looking at Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. Today, we're only going to give you snippets of 2 cases, Nicaragua and El Salvador, and then we're going to conclude with comments, maybe hopes for the future, policy recommendations, what we think could be the focus. So we start very broad. We include historical conditions, how we got to where we are, social conditions, economic, political. This is sort of like the broad lens we have, which includes a few more specific factors. In the regional context of Central America, historical legacies take us to understand the dictatorships in the region and how we're not necessarily backsliding. We're kind of just, some of those things are just re-emerging. And the legacy of the civil wars in the region, US intervention that has continued, and it's all over, deep, around, everywhere. And it's historical, so it's part of that historical context. social relations, we include work on gender inequalities, the religious influence, the religious ideology that has been present, but we're trying to connect to gender-based violence. Economic inequalities that include specific vulnerabilities for women, and political dynamics, consolidation of power, and militarization. Two things about these four main areas that we're including in our explanation is that they are very much interrelated. This is an intersectional approach of these different structural factors. These affect everyone, as Maria was saying, these affect everyone, but we are bringing special attention to how all of these together affect the lives of women, affect the creation of conditions for gender-based violence and violences in plural, the maintenance of these conditions of violence, and the undermining of access to justice. All of these are interrelated, affect everybody, but we are bringing special attention to how they affect women. So we have four chapters, 4 cases. Because we can't cover everything, we are organizing it in the following way. The chapter on El Salvador, which we'll present a little bit of today, focuses on authoritarianism, probably for obvious reasons. But these factors don't only happen in those countries. So authoritarianism, we just focus on El Salvador to go more in depth, but it doesn't mean that that authoritarianism is not present in the other three cases. Militarization, we go in depth for militarization in Honduras, but we start out with a broader introduction of militarization in the region. Religious ideologies, conservative religious ideologies, we take a deep dive in Nicaragua for that. And for media, in campaigns of disinformation and misinformation, we focus on Guatemala, but again, it happens in the other 4 countries as well, 3 countries as well. A very important aspect of how we arrived at our analytical framework is that this is based on interviews we conducted with women in Central America, women in academia, in law, in the justice system, in various sectors of society in the different countries. The interviews were very broad in general. Why? How do you see why these high levels of gender-based violence in your country? And so they were very broad. And so inductively, we arrived at these four factors that we are including in our analysis. So that's how we arrived at this. It's not just our own thinking. It comes from women on the ground who are doing this work. And Pamela is going to present the 4 cases. Oh, no, 2 cases.
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you also to Carlos and the University of Florida for the invitation to be here. I'm honored to be sharing some of this work, which is also, so like some of my panelists said, kind of a work in progress. It is a book project, so this is just a small piece of our work today. So I first want to talk a little bit about how the framework that Cecilia outlined fits in with the case of Nicaragua. As I think most of us probably know, Nicaragua has gone through a long process of moving from an autocratic legal system, beginning really in 2006 when Daniel Ortega returned to power. But this transitioned rapidly following the mass mobilization in 2018 into widespread political violence and really a police state, right? Before 2018 in Nicaragua, what we were seeing was legal maneuvering, taking control of the courts, taking control of the electoral system, changing particular laws and gaining control of various institutions in order to consolidate power. But with the widespread citizen uprising in 2018, that changed to direct violence. And there were other things like the silencing of the press that contributed to really silencing the population. And this had particular impacts on women and girls, particularly because sort of integrated with this authoritarian regime was, of course, Ortega's alliance with different conservative religious groups. This was an essential piece of the discourse and the justification for some of the specific legal changes that directly impacted women and girls in the region. So some of the concrete manifestations of this were the criminalization of abortion, which was an electoral promise that Ortega made when he was first reelected, and he made good on that promise. He has been, instrumental in supporting the rollback of critical gender-based violence laws. Ley 779, which was a key piece of legislation that criminalized femicide in Nicaragua and provided many more additional protections for women in cases of gender-based violence, was essentially completely dismantled over the course of 2 years between 2012 and 2014, to the point where we went from a system in which women had the right to make claims and press charges to being essentially forced into mediation, right? So hence the photos that you see there, those are from fieldwork that I conducted between 2012 and 2014. On the top is a women's rights organization protest regarding the gender violence law. And on the bottom was the inauguration of the family counseling office inside of the women's police station. So there was this direct sort of integration of religious ideology into the approach to gender-based violence that had a direct impact on women's ability to get justice in these cases. And there was also, following the citizen uprising in 2018, what we saw was a systematic dismantling of women's organizations and a broader array of human rights organizations across the country. There has been the massive exile of many of the leaders of these organizations. I mentioned their research done by Confidencial, which is an independent media source in Nicaragua. According to their data collection, over 140 organizations have been impacted since 2018. And now the women's organizations that are still around are completely underground. They are no longer protesting in the streets because they would be sent to jail if they did so. And the communication has completely changed to be almost exclusively via channels that the government cannot monitor, like WhatsApp, right? So all of the communication has become very secretive. And people have changed their Facebook profiles, right? There's a lot of attempts to stay quiet, right? For obvious reasons now. I also wanted to briefly show you some of the data that I collected using government sources. I wanted to also mention, connected to our framework looking at media disinformation and government transparency around data. Up until 2018, the government provided data on femicide, rape, aggravated rape, and intimidation and threats against women. After that, there's no more systematic data available on those statistics. And there's quite a lot of controversy over the numbers of femicides in Nicaragua. Many of these cases are being investigated as homicides or as parricides under other provisions in Nicaraguan law. But independent monitoring organizations like Las Católicas por el Derecho de Decidir have much larger estimates of how many cases they have documented. So all of this is related to the broader impacts of the gendered consequences of authoritarianism in Nicaragua. That's just, a snapshot. Now a little bit about the case of El Salvador, which I know we're going to hear a lot more about tomorrow as well. So I want to focus specifically on some of the gender dimension of what has happened since Nayib Bukele became president. There has been a systematic reorganization of the bureaucracy, of the political priorities of the Bukele administration, a reduced emphasis on resources for social and legal services for women. For example, Ciudad Mujer, which was a very popular program, even though women's access to the resources provided by these offices was limited, it was a symbolic gesture towards women's access to justice and resources in the country. That budget was dramatically reduced. Of course, there was a dramatic shift in the focus exclusively on so-called criminal and gang violence. And at the same time, continuing to incarcerate women for abortion. But one of the main changes, in the overall daily life of all communities, but has particular impacts for women, is this presence of soldiers and police in communities, in neighborhoods all over the country. And so based on research done by La Universidad Centroamericana in El Salvador, more than 70% of residents now report having a police presence where they live in 2022. And there's also, according to the interviews we conducted, a movement to catalog femicides as disappearances. So undercounting the gender dimensions of violence that continue, even though the administration is now claiming that the country is safe, right? But the question is, safe for whom? Okay, just to kind of put a point on that, here is some data on the total reported incidents of violence against women between 2019 and 2022, the latest statistics available. So these crimes are still happening. It's just that there's no attention being paid to them. And at the same time, there is also across the region, not just in El Salvador, but in all the 4 countries that we are looking at, there's systematic attacks on women's rights defenders, and this coincides with what we heard from the other presenters today. And so with the help of a graduate assistant, we were able to gather some data on what kinds of attacks on women's rights defenders are more common. Intimidation is the most common of these, exclusion from political spaces, bodily harm, incarceration, seizure of property, exile, forced displacement, removal of organizations' legal status, blocked access to information. All of these things are happening, and we were able to do some analysis about which strategies are most common in each country. So you can kind of see there what the patterns are. But for the sake of time, I'm gonna jump to just one quote from an interview that we conducted with María Teresa Blandón, a longtime feminist activist in Nicaragua. Maybe some of you are familiar with her work with La Corriente, which is a very important organization for gender and reproductive rights in Nicaragua. And today, she really put a point on this idea that Central America is at a crossroads with the intersections of authoritarianism, with militarization, the criminalization of protest, the shrinking of civic spaces, that it's like a powder keg. And all of these factors need to be taken into consideration, if we really want to address what the political leaders in the United States are calling la crisis migratoria. And I will turn it over to Cecilia for our final points before we wrap up.
Just 1 minute. The last slide is just 1 minute. So, so our examination, we're hoping that it provides a very different picture of what the root causes for migration and for the destabilization of the region may look like. And so based on this, on our examination, we are hopeful for some change that could move away from the securitization that is being promoted so deeply in the region, that relies on law enforcement to pacify the population and put them in prison for whatever reason, to invest in greater resources in social infrastructure, to support grassroots organizations, especially women's organizations that are being attacked. Rather than attacking them, they should get funding to do the work they do, to encourage informational and institutional transparency, and to consider potential strategies for repairing historical harms to Central America caused by the United States. So thank you so much.
So thank you to all our panelists for those wonderful interventions. So now we're going to go to Q&A. So if you please raise your hand and I will try to and say your name so we can start the discussion. Susan.
Feminicides, they could fight against homicides. I think in Mexico, 90% of victims of homicides are men. instead of fighting for the integrity of women's bodies against violence, they could fight against violence against men in the workplace, where over 90% of occupational deaths are men. Right? But I fear that there's some tremendous ideology of gender that's pushing against that, convincing men, you guys are the winners, you better defend this system with your life, defend the status quo, and don't let the feminists tell you there's gender things with men. Right? So how do we deal with that resistance against applying gender considerations to everybody, which you're proposing?
Yeah, well, yes, you're right. That it's it is a very difficult battle to fight. And our argument comes from this idea precisely that the critics of the feminist movement in Mexico have been blaming it for being sectarian, they can call it that, or the president have called them conservative and a product of the neoliberal elites outside the country. And then we think that they have not helped themselves when the chants during protest events are also exclusionary against men. So that's our recommendation, that if you want to fight that discourse against feminism, then present yourself as the savior. So that's all we're saying. We're not criticizing them for their struggle. We're not criticizing their achievements. It's only that to gain further legitimacy from the direct beneficiaries, just present yourself as the one that it's gonna protect their rights as well. Not as their mother, by the way. We're not protecting them as their mother.
Paulina?
So this is a question for all of you, whomever wants to pick it up first. I noticed that it seemed like at the beginning, it seems that this is a right-wing, left-wing pattern, but then it turns out that it's not obviously a left-wing, right-wing pattern, but it's mostly like a patriarchy, autocracy on the one side and something else on the other. So what is on the other side? So this on one side, I mean, if it's not a left and right issue, and if we wanted to establish another kind of a spectrum of ideologies that we're looking at, what is the other spectrum, the other side of the spectrum? You have patriarchy and autocracy or centralization of power. And then what's on the other side? Like only? So would you say that in general, you could have like patriarchy and feminism as the background of all the fights in the region rather than have populism? Is that where you're going, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm sort of trying to still figure out and get at how to articulate it is that gendered hierarchies, but I mean, this doesn't apply just to gender. We can think about it in terms of sexuality. We can think about it in terms of race, but these sort of social hierarchies of power operate above and around all these different systems. So they infiltrate in the right. They don't infiltrate in the left. They don't necessarily discriminate. They manifest themselves differently. So the way in which we see anti-genderism play out, or the way in which we see, resistance to feminist and LGBTQ rights will look different in right-wing, left-wing, illiberal contexts, but also it exists in liberal democracies. And so it all looks different in those contexts. So that's sort of what I'm trying to say, that it's not a political ideology per se, is that these systems perpetuate these in different ways. Does that make sense?
just kept on agreeing with you, Elizabeth. But yes, I think it's I fully agree with Elizabeth, especially that we probably have to get out of the binaries of thinking. This is why Luz de Alba's presentation was so illuminating to me, because it's a new party, it's a new way that is not one or the other. And it's something that that resonates strongly with this with a new thinking of these are not political. You cannot really classify these into political ideologies, because it is sort of supra political ideologies. For instance, the use of the courts and the legal systems to dismantle democratic elements that were there. That gives us a sense of some democracy there, but it's not. And so it's difficult to classify the cases we're looking at in Central America as even as backsliding from democracy, because I don't know if it's the case, because they have adopted certain elements that to the international community appear as democratic, certain signals, but they are using those signals to continue to remain in power as regimes, as autocratic regimes, using the courts, using the voting, even though voting, look at what happened in Guatemala. So using tools that have a semblance of democracy to then continue and foment and cement this autocratic forms of that intersect with all the other things that we've talked about. So it's difficult to think of of a duality in ideologies when it's more like on top, like Elizabeth was saying.
Yeah, just to add one more thing. I mean, I think it's sort of thinking about, someone mentioned sort of this Gramscian sense of hegemony, right? And that's sort of how I sort of see it, and it doesn't discriminate, right? It just changes character and changes its appearance and its justifications in a very, hegemonic sense.
Let me disagree a bit, because I think that the right-left distinction is very important, especially when I mean, of course, I'm not sanitizing the left. The left can be very anti-gender, but they have to be ambiguous, at least when they do that. I mean, let's think, for instance, about Chavez in Venezuela. Chavez gave women a series of economic rights. He was never pro-LGBTQ rights. So, but at least they tried to have a semblance or a facade of inclusion. Right-wing populists, or if you want to call them wannabe fascists or post-fascists, whatever we want to call this new crop of leaders, they don't care. I mean, they just want to go back to the good old times when the wife was in the kitchen, and to reinforce and recreate the patriarchal family with all of that what implies. But I think that right and left is not everything, but it's something very important there.
I think it is important. It's not to say that it's not important. I think it's important to see how it manifests itself differently. But you're right. It's a facade. Like, it's not that gender equality is central or the driving force. It is patriarchal norms and these other norms that are driving it, and will use and capitalize on it. And so understanding how it manifests differently in right or left contexts is important for sure, but it's not a left or right wing phenomenon.
Thank you. Yeah, it's related to Paulina's question. I was thinking about the Mexican context, and I think the duality that you compare it with left and right, but will be populism against citizenship, right? And so, again, going back to my idea of women defending the rights of all, you're defending the rights of the citizenry, so citizens' rights against populism, especially when we think about the López Obrador discourse between the elites and el pueblo, right? So
Can I just say one more, sorry, can I say one more brief thing about this? I see some hands up, so I don't want to like cut the discussion off, but I do want to say that the use of ideas about gender and sexuality, I agree there are some differences in how the left and the right approach it. But I would say even on the left, the use of discourses and even policies related to gender and sexuality are very instrumental. They're not in and of themselves, like because they actually are interested in the goal of gender equality or sexual equality. We could look at Nicaragua as an example of this. Ortega was very strategic in trying to break the LGBTQ alliance with the feminist movement by giving certain symbolic concessions to the LGBT community so that they would, be less aligned with the feminist movement, which he was always interested in completely undermining and destroying from the very beginning, because the feminist movement rejected him back in the 90s and he's never forgiven them for that. So, that's just one example.
Thank you. My question is from Maria. Thank you, Maria, for your presentation. I think it's very interesting how you were talking about how Andrés Manuel López Obrador was used to consider by feminists like an ally, and now things are not so clear for some people, and they're like crystal clear for some other people, right? So my question is that both parties, well, not both parties, but Morena and the Alianza, PRI, PAN, PRD, both of them are playing right now the gender part. And we have Claudia Sheinbaum and I just forgot her name. Thank you, Xochitl Galvez running for presidency. And I don't think, I mean, I don't know, but do you feel like either Claudia or Xochitl are going to fight not only for women's rights, but also for the LGBTQ plus community? Thank you, Maria.
thank you. Well, yes, I mean, it didn't say anything, but Mexico is going to have a women's president one way or another. And that's a good thing. I would not put the pressure on Claudia or Xochitl to do that, but more on the legislature. And mujeres en plural, have been doing a lot of that. So I trust those women that are in the legislature that they're going to put forward the pieces that are necessary. And they have been doing so already. In Mexico, the law has been passed that all parties have to have gender parity when they put people to run for office. So gender parity is already guaranteed in the number of women that run, that not necessarily win, but that has increased the number of women in the legislature. And knowing their alliances that they have already built to pass the laws that they have passed that I mentioned here, but also especially for legislating in favor of abortion rights, they have been very successful. So I will put the pressure on them.
For example, some of these people that you're talking about, specifically in Monterrey, they were there because of the gender quota, and there were women, they were women voting against abortion in Monterrey. They were there because of the quota gender, but they were banning rights for women. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And Mauro? Sorry. Well, I have the microphone.
My question is to all of you. I don't know who is going to answer, but I think that all the oppressions are connected. So what's the role of capitalism in gender discrimination, racism, and homophobia? That's it. Thank you so much.
Oh, good.
Same, not mine, but the same question. This is exactly what I was going to ask the panel. First of all, to commend the organizers to start this conference with an amazing panel about this such an important question, and with a keynote exactly about the centrality of gender in this process of backsliding in the Americas. So, and I think it's highly under-theorized, highly needed to have your empirical work. So I can't wait to read all the work that's coming. However, what's new, right? What's new? Patriarchy, sexism, misogyny has been in Latin America since the colonial times, right? So what's new? Why we're talking about the far right, a new type of right, and how does it intersect with gender? And my question is, of course, if we're speaking about gender as a social construct, we can also think about masculinity, right? So I don't like to talk as much about the slogan of intersectionality, right? But the question is to you, I would pose is, how does gender intersect with, right, the socioeconomic transformation that Latin Americans experience? There is a little bit of work in the US showing that support for Trump is higher in communities that have been highly devastated by neoliberal transformation, where men lost their well-paying jobs, lost that role of the breadwinner, right? So we have the intersection of class transformation and gender. In the case of Mexico, right, that Maria presented, I'm fully supportive of your recommendations. On the other hand, there is a lot of research about the feminist movement's class and racial bias. It's overwhelmingly white, middle, and upper class. To what extent does it represent? Part of its failure is exactly to articulate with the struggles of women that are not, right? Just to mention one example is the historical disassociation between the feminist movement and the question of domestic workers' rights, right? When in that regard, feminism is benefiting from, right, the availability of a cheap labor force of mostly Black and brown women to allow them to succeed professionally and politically and in other spheres. So these things are complicated, right? So I wonder if you could expand a little bit more about what you think is new here, and what, especially in terms of the far right.
To answer, to get to this, what's new, I mean, I think exactly it has always been and continues to be, so we haven't fixed it or solved it. So we need to keep studying it and we need to keep examining it. And why there's this push is because the dominant literature on populism and democratic backsliding thinks of gender as something on the side, as an upshot, as you know, a result of populism. And there's a need to center gender and say, if we look at gender, what do we see that we weren't seeing before, right? And that's sort of the hope for it. An example, thinking about this Trump study, or you know, that you're thinking about, I mean, there's studies that have shown, like, if we look at white men and white women who support Trump, those numbers, yes, they align with socioeconomic issues. When they take it, instead of measuring it by biological sex, man versus female, or man, woman, and they look at it through gender identity, those numbers get greater. So the more masculine So the more likely that a white Trump supporter, the more masculine he identifies as, the more likely he is, this sounds really loud, the more likely he is to support Trump. And same thing, the more sort of feminine in terms of traditional feminine ideas that a white Trump supporter identifies with are more likely to support Trump. So we get a better indication of the roles that masculinity and femininity are playing in underlying these forces.
Fernanda, okay. Thinking about what all of you are asking, it is about patriarchy and what is in the other side. Most of us believe that it is patriarchy and feminism, and I will add something else. Definitely capitalism has a lot to do, because right now we're in a battle between right, left, new right, ultra right. They're seeking for free market, and they believe in inequalities. They believe in inequalities, perfect for capitalism. Capitalism doesn't matter if you are whatever. They use our identities in order to exploit. What does patriarchy does? Well, dominates women, subordination of women. And when I always tell to my students, I'm going to say in Spanish, el capitalismo, capitalism, and feminine and patriarchy, it's like a tango dance. Tango dance, they're always dancing, but that dance is perfect, because if they have to give rights to women, that's what capitalism needs, they will do it. However, that doesn't mean the patriarchy is going to let go their interest. So, it's different ways in different historical contexts, using different ideologies, political ideologies, to re-articulate the subordination of women for the advance of capitalism. That's what I think. It's a very complex situation. I am listening to my panel and I'm reflecting on my case. My case is, there has a huge similar, but it has a huge difference. We're talking about a US colony, but we don't talk about Puerto Rico as a colony. Not even Trump. Trump wants to cede to Netherlands, I think, Puerto Rico for $1. That's what he said. He went to Puerto Rico and said, I'm gonna give Puerto Rico to the Netherlands if they give me $1, for $1, and we will sign the papers. It's a very complex, because it has situations from the north, from the US, and also from the Latin America. It's a very complex, but in my reflection is, I remember the tango dance. They're dancing tangos and incorporating gender ideologies with populism, gender ideologies with the right, the new right, or the ultra right. The left is something else. And you have all these kinds of differences where there are gains and losses. And what I think as a researcher we have to explore those cases in order to discover that other part. And because in some places it would be, I just said capitalism in a big way, but I said capitalism with feminism. What is it in there? And what is it in patriarchy and feminism that might give us a more complex and rigorous answer to those questions that are very important? Because all of these have important consequences for mobilization. Maria just presented a case in Mexico where what does feminist movement needs to do in order to legitimize or gain more exposition? I don't know. We need to research that, but definitely the other side, I think, both sides need to be complicated. Patriarchy and capitalism as well.
Yeah, just very, very quickly. What is new? Yes, we've had gender inequality, all the things since colonial times, before, who knows, all over the world, because gender inequalities are pretty universal. with some exceptions. But what is new today, I think we are in a very different historical moment where we have a system of rights. People are aware that they have the possibility of having rights. And so when that doesn't happen because of different structures, people question and react and protest. But I think it's a different confluence of factors at this historical moment where we have the forces of capitalism, of course, that shape expectations of standards of living, shape expectations of what people can achieve. At the same time that there is a system of rights that shape expectations about what people can aspire to. And I think that makes a difference today than in the past.
I also want to respond, not surprisingly, to the question of what's new. I feel like I'm just going to say something very similar to what the other panelists have said. But patriarchy and capitalism both evolve. They don't look the same now that they did a decade ago, 2 decades ago, 100 years ago, right? We use the same word for the system because what we're talking about overall is a system in which men's power, resources, and authority is superior to women's, and that's still the case. But the way that that plays out in terms of the legal rights, right? The legal systems that are in place, the political processes, the institutions that exist, those things are there, but the underlying ideologies are still way different than what the law says, right? Those cultural ideologies, those cultural processes, they're finding a way to re-infiltrate into these institutions. And so, yes, that explains why you can have a gender quota and you can have a lot of women in political power still replicating the patriarchy, because more women doesn't equal gender equality.
About women's movements leading resistance against democratic backsliding. But I was reminded very much of the literature on regime transition from 30 or 40 years ago. And I thought about the work of people like Georgina Whalen and Lisa Baldes, who pointed out that movements for democratization often included an outsized role for women, involved women's mobilization. When you looked at elections, transitional elections, there was always a gender gap. Nowadays, when we look at elections in which populists are ejected from power, that same gender gap is there. In a number of countries, women's movements are on the cutting edge of resistance to populism. How do we avoid the victory over dictatorship in which women play an outsized role, and then afterwards women are sent back to their traditional roles? How do we change that dynamic this time around?
My question is for Professor Acevedo. If you take the platform presented by Proyecto Dignidad, I think you will find in the two leading parties exactly the same. Tata Charbonnier, who's a legislator who has been found guilty of corruption. She buried in her backyard money in thermos bottle, so the money wouldn't decay. She would fully agree with everything that Proyecto Dignidad presented. So what is the difference? I also saw of a tiny little detail, but I think it's revealing. The color that they chose for the emblem, it's blue. And in Puerto Rico, the color is almost define you. And so that's pro-statehood. So I don't see the difference between Proyecto Dignidad and the other parties.
Well, I must ask this, answer this in terms of the contradictions that we see that now. Yes, colors are defining. Blue is always associated with an exception. The PNP, the Partido Nuevo Progresista, we believe in statehood. What is different? The only difference that there is that they are not seeking any type of resolution to the status question. They don't even want to talk about that. That's not an issue at all. And if you ask them directly, they will say the following: whenever Puerto Ricans are ready, we are ready with them to play out this card. But right now, the card is not there. Why? The new right believes in common sense. And the common sense for them is that if you have the levels of corruption, political corruption that we see in Puerto Rico, he just shared the latest one. I think this week she's going to be given whatever the sentence is. The level of corruption. And corruption meaning the pro-statehood party, basically stealing money from federal funds. That's what it is. The Partido Dignidad, what they believe is that we have to recover dignity in order to come up to the table and negotiate something, which is true. Most of the PD people are annextionists, they're pro-statehood. But what is interesting is the blonde woman, the young blonde woman, she's not pro-statehood. She's independence. She's pro-independence. And everybody said, that's not possible. Yes, it is possible, because at this moment, what they want is the convergence. Catholics with Neopentecostales, evangelicals, and this is great for the strategy. It's a political strategy that they're playing out. What they want right now is to, in my view, is to align the public policies with the Republican ideas in the US. In that sense, they will be closer in their view, okay, closer in their view to get annexation. But at this moment, common sense tells you that you don't come to the US Congress to ask for any status resolution to the colonial status of Puerto Rico, because the levels of corruption are incredible. Moreover, there is a problem of governance, and I think I missed the point. I'm going to take advantage of this. There is a fiscal oversight board that the Congress of the US had on Puerto Rico. What does this mean? Puerto Rican has no say in public policy today about politics or about economics, special economics. But they have what? The cultural terrain, women's rights, the rights of the LGBT community, senators dealing with issues of entertainment and the trans doing that. So you sit down and you see the only thing that is left for Puerto Ricans to legislate is about these other issues. That's an advantage for the PD, Partido Dignidad, not for the New Progressive Party. Because for the New Progressive Party, I have to confess, I have seen the two platforms, and I must say that the PNP party is a lot more radical in terms of religious values. Amazing what I'm gonna say. The platform for the PNP during the 2020 election, this is the election of Rosselló's, Ricky Rosselló, perhaps you know who he is. He was the governor that was ousted by the people in the summer of 2019. He was the one who come up with the most extremist, conservative religious values, because he wanted to get the advantage of the electoral votes of the evangelicals. That's what he did. However, he had a big problem. He wanted the evangelicals with him, but he also wanted the community, the LGBT community. And the way that he does it was, okay, you in the legislature, you take care about the religious issue. Tata Pardonel came out of that part. And I, in the executive, I will deal with the LGBT community. Ooh, that was a bad combination. And it exploded. Exploded, and look what happens. A party that wants to seek the electorate of the PNP. And I must say, they have in the 2020 election, they did it. Why? Because the governor was a PNP elected. But listen, Puerto Rico is in a 33% of the votes went to the governor. For Puerto Ricans, that's an awful type of statistics for electoral politics. And in this coming election, everyone is trembling, and the moral panic has grown, and the secularist strategies have been very forceful. Why? Because the partisan is no longer there, and the Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana and the pro-independence party have come together in an alliance, and they will be presenting themselves as an alliance. And this is a problem for everyone, except for the US.
Can I actually respond to the gentleman's question that? Yes. So I think it's a great question. I don't have a full answer for you per se, but I think that it is something we need to think about in terms of women's experiences, what happens to women's movements, what happens to women's experiences in general and transitions to democracy. And it will look different. And it reminds me of, I do a lot of work in peace and security and the transition from conflict to quote unquote post-conflict. And if we think even about demobilization of combatants, if we're only thinking about combatants as a male soldier, we're missing 30% of the combatants, right? We have to think about their experiences. So I think when we're thinking about democratic transitions as well, a starting point is thinking, what assumptions are we making that need to be challenged a bit in terms of that could be gendered in a way, or sort of masculine assumptions that we're not quite aware of, and if we can attend to those. So I think looking at history, what happened, but also looking at what the context is now, that women's needs are going to be very specific and different. So I don't know if that hopes answers a little bit.
Thank you very much. Thinking about Michael's questions as well as your question over there, probably the reframing of the movement, especially in Mexico, will come sooner than what I was thinking in the beginning, which is particularly because we will have a woman's president, then the framing of the movement will have to change. And certainly having more women in the legislature does not mean gender equality, but the framing of the movement as such, and a movement against patriarchy, will have to shift. And that is going to be very interesting with having more women in Congress and having a women's president. How is the movement going to present and frame their causes?
Hi, thank you for all of your presentations. I kept thinking Maria's presentation on how feminism is suggested to present itself, and how Latin American feminism is different from all of the feminisms in the world because of the legislative history and the creation of this figure of feminicide. However, I keep asking myself, access to justice, feminicide is still happening, not only in units of nation states, but overall the continent. However, we are still analyzing these phenomena, of course, within these nation states. And I was thinking about the case of Mexico, which is probably one of the most important on the region. And that if Mexican feminists were to put this umbrella of human rights, then there's an oblivion of all of the feminist struggles in the continent, because it becomes something national. And I think it would break a little bit from the solidarity that has been built across Latin America. So my question is, so what do we do in the sense of how us as young scholars, most of us, or a lot of us Latin American in the global north, how do we position our academic work? And then on transnational feminist perspective too, at a grassroots level, what can we do as Bolivian, Peruvian, Chilean grassroots activists too, who are also scholars? Because I feel like the struggles within the feminist movement are taking a long time to develop. And we are still looking at not only class, but disability status and other axes of identity. So I would like to hear from your recommendations on how do we move forward, considering this transnational perspective into, well, creating or recreating, avoiding these backslidings of democracy.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the conference. I have a question about these issues, but about Black and Indigenous women in Latin America. What happened with the kind of women in these issues that you show us today?
Yes, no, this is very present in our work, not very extensively because we touch on so many other things, but we're dealing with Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. You have to take into account how all of these factors that we're considering impact women. We're focusing on women of different social positions differently. So it is a thread that we have, but it's not central, but it cannot. We're dealing with countries where, I mean, every country, but the countries that we're dealing with, you cannot, of course, leave that out. We have interviews, for instance, with Afro-descendant women in Nicaragua, in Honduras, and with Indigenous women in Guatemala. Not with Afro-descendant women in Guatemala, but we do have these voices of women that we are basing our analysis on, include not only women in different sectors, but also from different social positions. So it's there.
I just want to share something with you, because my picture presented a diversity slate, which is not the focus of my paper, but it is a point there to analyze. I must say the following. Afro-Caribbean women in Puerto Rico are left out of politics. In Puerto Rico, politics is a white male upper class issue. You don't have that much Black people there. You saw the woman, the Black woman there. She was the vice president of the PD. And the vice president of the PD aspired to become a governor's candidate for the 2024 election. But she was challenged by the male who believes that that party belongs to him. And all issues of misogyny, authoritism came out to a point that she decided to step out not only of the candidacy, but of the party. This is just an example, and I understand it's a big problem, and we should be looking at this issue of race, because race is an important axis of exclusion. And there's a lot of things that needs to be done at the political level so that more people from Black community comes to play, because it is important. It is part of democracy, I think.
I would also say that as I'm sort of thinking about this other concept of like, what is the ontological security narrative of a state or of institutions or of people in society, talking about gender very broadly, but it absolutely intersects with whiteness, with indigeneity, with capitalism, with all these other sort of hegemonic power structures at play. So I think this is sort of one dimension of power that governs how the world works, right? But we need to understand, certainly there are others at play, and in unpacking those, we have to, take those into consideration. Like it's not a zero-sum game. They all exist in these logics that govern our world, if that makes sense.
I would like to add that, especially to your question, and also to try to protect better the Afro and the indigenous women in the continent, supporting the cause for strengthening the rule of law and fighting impunity is going to help out. One of the first actions that this government took was not to support the bill that was built from civil society organizations to make the procurement of justice autonomous and independent. And the law that was passed by Morena only changed the name from the Office of the General Prosecutor to the Fiscalia, so from being the Procurator, and none of the rest of the bill was passed. So supporting those types of bill is going to help gender causes, or including the gender perspective in the procurement of justice, if you support the reforms that are needed to enforce the rule of law in the country.
I wanted to briefly address Edelweiss's question. Hi. It was a great question, and I have a full answer, but I do want to say maybe just two brief things. One is that I think it's really important to continue to call attention to feminicide all over the region. Mexico does get a lot of attention with good reason, but femicide rates are extremely high all over Latin America. In Central America, in fact, has some of the highest rates per 100,000 in the region as well. So I think it's important not to forget, like, small countries also have huge issues with gender-based violence. And so not collapsing these categories, I do think the gendered analysis really matters for the analysis of crime. And the other thing I wanted to say about that is, in order to elevate or make more visible these struggles, I think it's critical for scholars, whether we are from Latin America ourselves or just allies like myself as a white woman of, United States citizen, to be allies of the movements, the people doing the work on the ground. That's why it's so important, for Cecilia and I to have talked to women on the ground who are doing the work and listening to their voices and elevating their experience and collaborating with them. One of my mentors in grad school said something that I'll never forget, which is, the work that we need to do is the work that's urgently needed in the communities that we care about. And to do that, we need to be collaborating and listening to the people who are there, who are directly experiencing these realities, and asking them, what is the most useful thing I can do? What research questions can I ask? What topics can I write about? How can I elevate this work that you're doing and collaborate and walk alongside you? That's how I see my role. That's all I'd like to say. Thank you.
I have a question for any of the speakers. I'm from Brazil, and I've seen like lately there are public policies that have placed a primarily criminal justice response for domestic abuse against women. However, the Brazilian laws recognize that violence against women in domestic settings has a multifaceted issue that requires a holistic approach rather than solely on punitive measures. So my question is it possible to say that the reliance on the criminal justice system can be effective on tackling domestic abuse against women? Or is it just a concession made to feminist movements instead of readdressing the true causes that lead to violence against women? Thank you.
It's a great question, but I don't know if it's a concession. I think it's if the true causes that we have talked about were to be addressed, we wouldn't even need to have violence against women laws because they wouldn't be needed. However, we do have them, and the emphasis on the part of the activists and people on the ground is on having the Salvadoran activists, for instance, fought very hard to have violence all throughout Central America, fought very hard to have those laws in the books. Now, there's a big gap between the laws in the books and what happens in practice. And so a lot of the focus has gone in trying to reduce that gap a little bit to implement laws that are in the books. Now, some of those call for punitive approaches because it is, but it's just one slice of a much bigger pie, I guess, that includes all these other factors of inequality. But those other factors tend to be more difficult to address because they're not as on the ground as practical, I guess. So it's not that those other factors are forgotten. It's that there's a history of fighting for the laws and now fighting for some form of implementation within a context where there are other inequalities that exist that are not forgotten. And now I still have the microphone, so I'm going to say one more thing. I won't let go. I think Suzanne, when you asked about your very first question, still thinking, and you mentioned that 90% of the people who are victims of violence and or killings are men. And so yes, that's the case, except that as the Guatemalan anthropologist Gabriela Torres always reminds us, is that yes, many more men are killed, but women are overkilled. The killings of women tend to be quite excessive, and they're killed in very different ways. And women are often killed by people they know, and men are in really extreme ways. And men are killed usually by a bullet or by something immediate, not torture and things like that. So she stresses the difference between the overkilling of women and also the other multiple more invisible forms of violence in the lives of women that can eventuate in their killings. And in the killings, we'd also make a difference between femicide and feminicide. Femicide is the killing of women. Feminicide, which comes from Marcela Lagarde's work, points to the state as being at least partially culpable for that. So I just wanted to mention that. The overkilling is not killing. Sorry. Now the microphone is free.
Two points, very fast. One of the, in order to deal with domestic violence or violence against women, gender violence, whatever it's called in different places, it has to come up with a gender perspective education, because that's the only way. It is not a punitive approach. It is just an educational approach where you are teaching students from the very beginning all of these values that feminists have put forward in terms not only of equality and respect, you see? Because then when you talk about equality and respect with a gender neutral perspective, you're doing almost nothing. But we have to focus on the other things that the state could do in order to make these laws viable that people will respect. And my last question is, I know this is difficult for you to understand my paper, but those of you who are here, the University of Massachusetts has a digital review, and this paper, most of the research has been published by them on January, and it's Siglo XXII. You can get it online.
I found very interesting this idea of anti-genderism as a overall structure, independently of certain political regimes. I'm from Venezuela, and when Dr. Neumann presented the Nicaraguan case, I found a lot of commonalities. And yes, it's a leftist government that started with Chavez's rhetoric in pro of feminism, some feminism claims, but over the years it has shown, especially now, like the most conservative way, and we are last in the list of Latin American countries in terms of legal recognition. So I wanted to ask you, where do you find the sources of these overall structures, independently of those political regimes, and what is like perpetrating them?
Okay, hopefully I can answer this. So I'm trying to think about this. I don't know if this answers your questions, but sort of thinking about this concept of ontological insecurity and security, right? And sort of breaking down what the state, how they see themselves as, like, what is their sort of autobiographical narrative of who they are and their place in the world. And so that will inform how they respond to gender equality, like a push for more gender equality or a push back against gender inequality. So I think that that's why it will change from context to context. I don't know if that really answered. I don't know if I'm fully understanding your question.
If we think about a common structure or like independent of political regimes, like what are the pilares, pillars, yeah, similar, of that structure, and like if we were to act upon them, like where we would need to see, to look at, to address those independently of political ideologies or
I mean, I don't think that we need to like separate them from. I think my point is that they're infused in all contexts. So it's not that it needs to be taken out of and isolated, but it's understanding that it is it was there prior to, and it works through populism. So it's really looking at it case by case basis and how different. I think if you look at it at the state level, if you look at it through civil society, looking at it through interactions with religious communities, and trying to understand it individually in those each contexts. And then in theory, if you could collect a variety of them and bring them together, you might be able to step back and see some patterns across the system. But I think that it's going to be so specific to the context. But it's there regardless, even if it's super overt and in your face in right-wing populism, and not so much in left-wing populism. We might just have to look a little deeper and look for less visible ways in which it's operating. And then if you can identify those, then maybe, we then can, there's an opportunity to compare them and sort of shine the light of what are the common threads that kind of go across them. I hope that answers.
Very likely, but fun five, short break, and that 5:30 will be back for our speech.
¿Hablas español? ¿Sí? Ok. Yo vi, tú estás trabajando, tú tenías esta